Hi guys, welcome back to Philosophy Club. We are discussing Aristotle today. We are done with our series on Plato, which was an interesting run, and we'll try and cover the whole of Aristotle's large body of philosophy in this one discussion. So we have a big task ahead. So let's dive right in. Okay, Aristotle was, as everyone knows, a student of Plato. He studied under Plato for pretty much about 20 years, but after Plato died, Aristotle was not given chance to be the successor of the academy because of the differences that he had with Platonic philosophy, right? And the successor of philosophy then was Speusippus, who was Plato's nephew. So yeah, of course, Aristotle wasn't happy about that. And after that incident, he left the academy, and then he got a short stint to tutor Alexander the Great, who was Prince Philip's son. And of course, Alexander was very young when Plato was appointed his tutor. So there is speculation as to the sort of effect and the that he had on Alexander. Of course, I mean, we know that they discussed philosophy, ethics, and politics and all that. But of course, how much metaphysical stuff can a 13-year-old take from a tutor like Aristotle? So of course there are differences as to how much impact Aristotle had on Alexander. Nevertheless, that is not central to our discussion today because we are discussing Aristotle philosophy. After Aristotle returned to Athens, he established an alternate school, which was called the Lyceum. And the people who were associated with Lyceum and its philosophy were called the Peripatetics, which is named after a sort of a walkaway that they had near the campus of Lyceum, which was the Peripatatos. So yeah, it's named after the area it was in. So Peripatetics are the people who associate with Aristotle's philosophy. He philosophized, and he had three main areas of philosophy, which he divided into three sciences: the theoretical sciences, practical sciences, and the productive sciences. Theoretical sciences had things like physics and metaphysics, which talked about the world but did not have any practical implication, as in that they were knowledge for knowledge's sake. Right. Then we had the practical sciences, which were like ethics and politics, which had some practical implications on the real world. And then we had the productive sciences, which were focused on producing something, like something useful, like art, like ships, like agriculture, that came under the productive sciences. And of course, we are discussing Aristotle philosophy under two heads: Aristotle's methods and Aristotle's philosophy, and Aristotle's theories, right? So what do we mean by method? Of course, whenever a philosopher engages in philosophy, there are certain methods that he or she approves of, or he or she things are worth engaging with. And of course, there are differences among schools of philosophy as to which methods are significant and which methods are not as useful in thank you in reaching philosophical truths, right? Plato, for example, thought that our senses are deceptive, right? That we cannot arrive at certainty if we use our senses as our only means of arriving at knowledge. So he privileged rationality over empirical observation, right? On the other hand, we see that Aristotle is rejecting this sort of distrust of our senses and our empirical observations, right? He's not convinced by Plato's argument that our senses are deceptive. He does not either think that, oh, our senses perceive us, they present to us the absolute truth. No, he's sort of saying that, okay, our senses may not be as reliable, but I don't think that they're deceptive either. They more or less track the truth. And if we sort of use our tools of reason in a manner that sort of best explain the observation of our senses, that would be the best way to engage in philosophy and reach philosophical truths. So in keeping with this trust that Aristotle puts into empirical observation, we have a method that engages with his philosophy in a twofold method. There are two tools, two sort of raw materials that he uses to engage with his philosophy. One he calls his phenomena, and second he calls his endoxa. The phenomena, as the name suggests, I mean, it's a Greek word phenomenon, but we translate it to English phenomena, which basically means that the things around us that are happening, that we observe, they constitute the phenomena, right? And then we have the endoxa. Endoxa is the popular belief, or the word of the wise, or whatever, some reliable source of information that we have, But and of course, endoxa might be opinions of great philosophers who have come before him, or an endoxa might be, let's say, a prevalent opinion about things, right, that everyone accepts without questioning. That constitute the endoxa. The limit, of course, of reliability that one can impose on endoxa is limited, because, of course, the opinions of old philosophers can be fallible. And what's the point of engaging in philosophy if we accept whatever our ancestors say as the truth, right? So, of course, there is a degree of reliability we impose on endoxa, and there is a degree of suspicion we impose on endoxa. And of course, phenomena is what is out there. We cannot, the phenomena is just the way it is. Now, what happens that when we take these raw materials, phenomena and doxa, we need something to analyze this phenomena in doxa, right? And this, of course, this is where Aristotle's logic comes in. Logic is not a part of any of the three sciences, neither theoretical science, practical science, productive science. What Aristotle says logic is that it's something that engulfs all the science. It is a method that is used in all of reasoning, right? And Aristotle is credited with single-handedly inventing logic, as in the philosophers that came before him, of course, some reason good, some reason bad, but neither of them had a sort of a very developed system of logic, wherein that you use the system no matter where you use it. If you follow these rules and these steps included by in the study of logic, your claims will always be true, right? And he gave the first systematic set of logical deduction, the most simple logical deduction, that he called syllogisms, right? So what syllogisms are like, very simple line of two premise, one conclusion sort of arguments, right? Like a classic example that was not given by Aristotle, given by a philosopher way later using Aristotle's method, is that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Right. What happens through this structure is that it doesn't matter what you replace Socrates with, man is, and whatever. Aristotle never used these terms, Socrates, man, whatever. He used to use variables, because he believed that no matter what you place in front of X and Y in this equation, if your argument follows this structure, then your argument is valid by the very nature of the structure itself, right? And that is what he called the syllogistic truth, or the deductive, what we today call deductive reasoning, right? It does not matter what you place in the structure, the argument is valid nonetheless. Now, it only depends whether your argument is sound or not, whether you accept the truth of the premises, right? That determines whether the argument is correct or not, because there's no fault in reasoning in the structure. The argument is valid nonetheless. And of course, deductive reasoning is often opposed to what we today call inductive reasoning, which is like, instead of arguing from general truths, right, you argue with our observation of things, and then you sort of using those specific observations, you reach at a specific truth. So there is, of course, less accuracy with that. I'll give an example. For example, if we say that all bachelors are married, all bachelors are unmarried, right? This is a general truth. This is true no matter, what your observation is of the world or whatever. It precedes your observation. It is a priori, right? It precedes your observation of the world. So whatever, no matter which bachelor you find, the bachelor will always be unmarried, because it follows from a general truth, right? And then we have the inductive reasoning. For example, you see that swans are white, right? You see swans are white everywhere around you. The swans are white, right? So would it be reasonable for you to conclude that all swans are white? This is where the inductive reasoning comes in, right? Where you are arguing from specifics to the general conclusion. And of course, the larger data set you had, the larger set of observations you have, the more reliable is your inductive reasoning, and more reliable is the general truth upon which you read. But again, this general truth is not infallible, because it is limited by your observation. For example, if you check every swan around you, in your locality, and then reach at the conclusion that all swans are white, what is there to say maybe in some foreign country, or in a different part of the town, there might be some swans that might be black, right? And this is what happens, and this is something that we will study later, what David Hume will later call the problem with empirical reasoning, right? Is that this is actually something that happened in China. People in Europe just accepted that all swans are white, but then the explorers went to China, they saw, oh, there is something called a black swan, right? And they were like shocked, and that sort of undid a lot of science that was happening in that day, right? So yeah, but let's come back to Aristotle now. We discussed logic. deductive reasoning. Now, okay, we have the raw materials, phenomena, and doxa, we have the logic to analyze them, but what are the means through which we analyze them, right? Like what are the, like how strictly and how do we apply these logics in this? So Aristotle said, okay, there are two ways in which we can engage with phenomena and doxa through logic. One method he called science, the second method he called the dialectic, right? So science is basically when we are like more rigorous in our study, and we evaluate from certain first principles, right, which are true no matter what, and then we use them to identify the statements that are lesser known, right? For example, we know for a fact that let's like any truth that we have, when you sort of throw a rock from the top, right, it comes straight down, right, and it doesn't matter what the size of the rock is, it will always come down in the same amount of time, right? This is something that we have, that is something that that is an observation, a phenomena that we have, right? But how do we explain this happening, right? There are certain first principles to which we need to go to in order to explain this phenomena. Oh, that there is something called the mass of the object, which develop which depends on the gravitational pull, right? And from this gravitational pull, and this gravitational pull sort of relies like it is equal for no matter what the mass of the state, like mass of the object is, right? It doesn't happen that the gravitational pull is more for an object, less for an object, right? And it is from these first principles that we arrive at the understanding as to why both of this, the phenomena of both of these rocks falling together at the same time, right, is something that can be understood as in a manner that is scientific. So that is what science is. Of course, Aristotle was not privy to ideas of gravity. He was not privy to ideas of, like acceleration, motion, and, mass and all that. So, of course, the science that he did, it is an example that I'm trying to explain it with. Of course, Aristotle, on the other hand, thought that, a heavy object falls quickly to the ground, right? Rather than an object that is lighter. And of course, he does not sort of take into account that, okay, when you throw a feather, it is because of the resistance that air offers that it falls, slowly, not because of, not because of its weight. But of course, and that is something that physicist Neil deGrasse Tyson is very angry about. The people of that day did science, like very unmeticulously, experimentation pe dhyan nahi dete the hain, because because it doesn't take, to quote him, a grant from the National Science Foundation to throw like two rocks of different masses down at the same time, right? So of course. So this is what science. We go back to rigorous first principles, and we arrive at more solid ideas about our reality, right? But of course, the problem is, how do we reach the first principle? Where the first principles are? Of course, that is the realm of metaphysics. We need to sort of look around and see if there are any first principle on which we can arrive at. There are, so that is where physics becomes inadequate, right? But we need to go back to metaphysical principles to sort of evaluate those per truths. And how do we reach those metaphysical ideas? We can't do that through science, right? We can't reach, we can use science to if we have first principle, we can use science to elaborate further principles. But how do we reach the first principles, right? For that, we take dialectics, right? Dialectic is a more sort of a looser alternative to science, which is in which we are not so rigorous to about the first principles. We take any general principle, or any general endoxa that is like prevalent in that time, right? We take any opinion and sort of do a Socratic analysis of that, and go back and forth, and what we, the end result, what we are trying to achieve is that either we raise the certainty of that endoxa and sort of promote it to higher degree of rigorous truth, or we demote it, right, to then relegate it to the realm of doubt. Okay, this endoxa does not stand the Socratic analysis that we do through this dialectic of ours, through like subjecting it to logic. It does not stand it, so therefore we reject it, right? So this is like the method of method of Aristotle. And then we come to his theories. His most popular theory is his rejection of forms. Of course, that is what the canon says. Oh, Plato conceived forms. Aristotle rejected it. Why? Because he did not consider that there is any transcendent world of forms that that exist in the air, and sort of where we derive all our ideas of particulars from, right? what he believed rather was that there is like a rank order of similarity between, these individual things that gives them the properties that they do. The example I was thinking of while studying legal methods yesterday was our idea of rights, right? See, there are like two ideas of what we can have is right, right? Either in, we mean it in a sense of correctness, right? This is right, this is wrong, right? So in we are contrasting the rightness with the wrongness of an idea, right? And what do we say when we talk about the legal concept of rights, right? It is something that we have, we deserve, right? But that again, we contrast it to the idea of a wrong, as in the idea of a legal wrong, right? So there is a chain of similarity in these ideas that we, that we sort of associate with an idea that is opposite to it, that is the idea of wrongness, and there is a similar link inside it, right? That we try to find, that is based in, that is sort of, we can say that is based in language. But I think, of course, Aristotle is not doing a linguistic analysis, right? Later when we study Wittgenstein, we'll come to know that, what exactly is that, there's like nothing like forms, there's nothing like, there is intense similarity. What we, try to, and what we use to analyze these particulars are like the family of resemblance, but that will come later, way later, like in the 20th century. That is the linguistic analysis of Wittgenstein, but we're not concerned with that. For our purposes, we are concerned with what Aristotle called, let me just go to my notes, all this jargon, I need to remember. Okay, what he called his homonymy, right? The core-dependent homonymy, right? There is a core inside, like inside every concept, right? And it is according, and while these ideas are different, there is a core that is similar in them that sort of explains their similarity. That is core dependent homonymy of Aristotle's philosophy. Next we come to the theory of four causes. Of course, like he says that how do we explain the existence of anything? How do we explain being? Being is in the sense of something is is what? To be, right? So how do we explain being, as in how we explain the existence of anything? He said that there are four causes for every thing's being. First is the material cause, second is the formal cause, third is the efficient cause, and fourth is the final cause. Material cause means what it is made of, right? Like wood, for I think I gave the example of the chair. Let's stick to the example of a chair, right? What is the material cause of a chair? It is the wood, right? Wood that it is made of, right? And then we have the second cause, that is the formal cause of a chair, right? Formal cause of the chair is the shape of a chair, right? Which makes a chair what it is, right? We cannot have a chair that is not shaped like a chair, because then we'll not be able to sit on it, right? So that is the formal cause of the chair, that relates to its form, right? The formal. Then we have the efficient cause, as in who are the people, and who sort of came together and sort of chopped the wood, and sort of the carpenter who sort of sliced everything and made the chair what it is. They are the efficient causes of the chair. Then we have the final cause, which is like why the chair exists, what is the purpose of the chair. Like we cannot, people are not just just waking up and making these chairs out of like no reason, because they're just interested in making chairs, right? Because we need chairs. There is a purpose that chairs serve. That is why we sort of engage in this activity of making chairs. That is the final cause of the chair, and that is where his Aristotle's teleology derives from, right? We'll come to that. First we'll come to hylomorphism, which is like a theory of change that Aristotle derived using the theory of four causes, right? So what Aristotle says that the change depends on two of these causes, material cause and formal cause, right? So what happens in change is that the matter of the stuff remains the same, but its form changes, right? For example, ice melted. What is the change that happened, right? Aristotle would say, okay, the matter, like the material cause is the same. It is that it was water then, it is water now. What has happened is that the form of water has changed, right? So this is what he called hylomorphism, is that matter remains same, the form is changing. There is something that remains constant, something that changes. So what changes is the form. The material cause remains the same, right? Matter remains the same. That is Aristotle's theory of hylomorphism. Let's come to his teleology. Teleology, of course, as we know, means that the ends justify the means, right? What what Aristotle means by teleology is something different. Is that, the cause of the universe itself, and all things can be explained with their final cause. That is what the teleology means in Aristotelian terms, right? That we do not need its material cause, or formal cause or efficient cause to explain it, as much as its final cause. He points to nature and says, oh, there are like everything around us as a purpose, right? Like it fits in like a big jigsaw puzzle, right? There is some need, and there is a thing in nature which sort of solves that need. So he says that, okay, nature is exhibiting teleology, right? So and it is based on this teleology that he sort of bases his ethics and politics in his text Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, right? So of course, Nicomachean ethics are virtue based ethics, right? And which is of course based on some theological aspect, as in what is important in our life is to strive for values which we need to achieve in and of themselves, right? You don't need to pursue them for some other goal, right? For example, Aristotle will derive moving before money. Why? Because at the end of the day, you use money to do something, right? To buy something, right? And you buy something to get something out of it. So there is these things that we sort of people run after. These are not the final causes of things, right? Like why we engage in this activity in the first place. Aristotle would always say that look at what at the end of the day gives you the sort of the final satisfaction, which is something that he relates with the concept of happiness. But of course, happiness is a very vague term. What do we mean by happiness? That is something that he engages in Nicomachean Ethics with, right? And with what he thinks that happiness is living a virtuous lives, right? Living a life of based on virtues like temperance, right? No excess of something, or no deficit of something. For example, there is like courage, we say, is a virtue because it is something that is that is a temperate value, right? It is a virtue that is exercising temperance, because like a too much courage will result in foolhardiness, and too little courage will sort of result in cowardice, right? So courage is the middle path. It is a sort of temperate way, and it sort of relates to Buddha's aspect of Buddha's conception of middle path. And it will be interesting when we do Indian philosophy to see how it compares, how the theories of these like people who live far away in time and space sort of reach a similar conclusion. It's interesting to sort of do this sort of analysis. But yeah, for now, this is all that we this is the summary of all what we are going to discuss. And I am be speaking for way too long. So I now open the floor to discussions. So yeah, of course, whatever points you want to discuss, whatever questions you have, anything, please throw.
The conclusion that I got from all this is that Aristotle is to blame for the syllogism questions that we got in our exam prep. If you're blaming
May I
someone,
add something?
Yeah, Nandini,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Abhineet. I heard about everything about Aristotle that you said, and I think one thing that you missed, and that was really important to us as lawyers, is the art of rhetoric of Aristotle. Now, this is something I always feel that in the practical aspect of law, as lawyers will be needing. So, for those of you who don't know about the art of rhetoric, I'll just elaborate a little bit so that we can further add it to our discussion. The art of rhetoric is basically the art of persuasion. Now, Abhineet spoke about dialectic. So I'll just differentiate in short what is the difference between dialectic and rhetoric so that we can better understand rhetoric. Uh, Now, dialectic uses argumentative methods only. But rhetoric, we can also apply non-argumentative methods such as, appealing to the emotions of the people, the character, ethos, and pathos that are referred to. Okay, before I go to ethos and pathos, let me just tell you the three important parts of rhetoric as elucidated by Aristotle. So first is logos, logic, logical reasoning, appealing to the logic. Second is pathos, which is appealing to the emotion of the person. Third is ethos, which is the credibility and the character of the speaker. So now, how does this art of rhetoric work? When we are trying to persuade somebody, it's not just the logic of our argument that's going to make a difference. It's also the way we approach the other audience. I'm sorry. So we need to understand the background of the audience to better tackle them, to better, strike to their chord so that we can persuade them to our benefit. Like as lawyers, it's our job to convince the judge, to persuade him uh, in our favor, to persuade him of our argument. So let's say the judge has a certain background, has a certain, and he has a certain background, he has a certain age, fortune, all of those characteristics. Let's say the judge belongs to a certain caste, and that has seen a certain amount of, that was underprivileged in the past or has faced certain criticism or deprived of certain amenities in the past. Now if we try to frame our argument in a certain manner that appeals to that judge's that if we could frame our argument in such a way that we consider his background and appeal to him, we'll be able to convince him in a better manner than if we don't consider this aspect. Secondly, the credibility of the author. Now, let's say the lawyer who's standing over there, he is considered to be, he's a renowned jurist, he's a renowned lawyer of the country, or he's seen to be a very, very uprighteous person. So the credibility of the speaker, of the lawyer, is also going to impact the judge. So these are a few things that impact a person's argument, impact how persuasive he is in the argument. And apart from that, I think we're having a great discussion on Aristotle. And so I think, yeah, we can continue from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Nandini, for pointing out. Yeah, I think we missed like Aristotle's view on art and rhetoric. Partly because I thought that the discussion was getting a bit too lengthy, but I think if now that you've brought in, I think that we should discuss the art and rhetoric aspect as well. I think Nandini talked about pathos, ethos, and logos. That is the Aristotle's theory of rhetoric. There is also Aristotle's theory of art as to what art is and what art does. That is, of course, a part of philosophy that we call aesthetics, right? Which is a part of axiology. Axiology has two parts: ethics and aesthetics. So in aesthetics, this rhetoric comes in. Aesthetics, we also have the Aristotle's conception of mimesis, right? That he gave the idea that what art basically does is that it copies reality, right? And Plato sort of relegated this copying to like a more inferior reality, that it does not talk about the forms, it talks about the copy of forms, right? Which is not the real thing. But Aristotle does not draw this distinction between the real thing and more real thing, right? Whatever. So for him, everything is equal. So he does not denounce this copy or the mimesis of something to a realm of inferiority. For example, for him, art serves a very specific purpose in society, which is to for the purposes of training, for purposes of even pleasure in its own end, right? So that is Aristotle's conception of art, and of course rhetoric, explained well by Nandini. Since we have added that, let's add that to our discussion as well. Thank you, Nandini. And also, let's move on to any questions that someone has in their understanding, because if we just sort of keep discussing things, there might be some doubts that that might hamper our entire understanding of it. And sometimes these and sometimes, and most of these times, they really add to our understanding of things. So please, if anyone has any questions to ask, please ask, or if anyone has any additions, that is fine as well.
Yeah, Vinita, I think it'd be helpful if you talk about what Zeno's paradox actually is, which is referred in the note. A lot of us may not be knowing about it, right? The paradox of Zeno.
I mean, I use it to sort of slightly explain what endoxa might mean. Zeno's paradox is, of course, Zeno was from the Eleatic school, right? Zeno was a philosopher who was pre-Socratic. He was not influenced by Socrates and his philosophy, and did not imply the rigorous rhetoric, use of the Socratic method that Plato and Aristotle usually use in their philosophy. Zeno's paradox is basically like two sets of reasoning that he gave as to why motion and time do not exist, right? Which might sound very weird to you, and weird to anyone who sort of presupposes these ideas, because to understand Zeno, we need to understand his roots which go his roots which go back to Parmenides, right? Who was a monist, who believed that plurality does not exist. All things are like one part of like a one whole thing. And what if we see difference, what we are saying is that is an illusion. Motion is an illusion. Time is an illusion, right? I think it is not as important to understand them because, of course, these are like very long rejected. Even like in the ancient world, these claims were, like rejected because of their, inconsistency with Aristotle, even Plato and both Aristotle's philosophy. So I don't think that we need to engage a lot in that. Don't like stress on like Zeno's, what Zeno's paradox was or what it was. It's not that important to really. No one talks about Zeno today. People talk about Aristotle and Plato. Let's just stay there. Yeah.
Yeah, so in our last discussion about Plato, I remember raising the question, which was sort of Godwin's law-esque, that what is the form of Hitler? Like what form of Hitler can there be which does the most good? Whatever like Plato's theory was. And I think Aristotle's critique of Plato was very helpful to help me understand my own critique. So when Aristotle talks about how good means different things in different contexts, essentially when Aristotle talks about homonymity, that helped me realize that yes, what I meant to say about Plato was that since Plato is assigning a form to everything and everyone, saying that there's a form to this, there's a form to that, and saying that the form contains the most good the thing. Plato means different, like there's different meanings to the word good for different things, right? However, the problem was that Plato is just saying that the form has the most good. And that is when the problem arises. Because I said, how can there be a form of Hitler which has good in it? So I think maybe a better word or maybe a better term for saying what a form contains is that it is more true to it's truest to the essence of Hitler. So the form of Hitler is the truest form of Hitler. And in that sense, it's good because Hitler is at its truest form and more truth is good. So let's say that there's a form of Abhinit, which is the most Abhinit, like philosophy 100 Abhinit. So that's good, but others might find it, like, what is this? It's very irritating. The form of Abhinit is irritating because it's too much philosophy. So, yeah, so that helped me clarify. Like, I think that this helped me understand that criticism which I had of Plato better, that I felt was there somewhere in my mind, but I just couldn't articulate it very well. So, yeah, I find that the critique of homonymy is a very strong criticism of the form.
Yeah, I mean, like, of course, Aristotle did not talk about, having forms of specific people, but yeah, he talked about qualities, right? And he said that these qualities. Oh, yeah. Wait a second, guys. Yeah, and he talked about how these qualities, of course, have like there's a common link, right? When you talk about the form of Hitler, what you're talking about is the form of tyranny, right? Which is a quality. So I mean, like people do not have specific quality, but yeah, I got what you were trying to say. Is that even what can be the best form of tyranny? There's no best form of tyranny, like it's truest form and whatever. I think that sort of explains forms, but of course Aristotle rejected these forms, and he had some solid grounds, one would say, for him. And this marks a very long divide in philosophy, which marks the divide of transcendence versus the divide of transcendent as opposed to immanence, right? Transcendence says that, oh, there is a higher realm, right, from which we sort of from which all things sort of delineate, right? There is a higher form, world of forms, and from which like more particular truths emanate, right? Compare and just like sort of contrast this to a form of philosophy that Nietzsche was involved in, to the form of philosophy that Spinoza was involved in, Gilles Deleuze was involved in. They are the philosophers of eminence, right? Like we'll study about them later. But what basically this means, and Aristotle, to of course a certain extent, was focused on more of the immanent side, right? As opposed to Plato, who focused on the transcendent side. But he said that, oh, there is the world, earth is trickle down heaven. Yeah, very tall, divine. So yeah, so what basically the world around us exists, that is all there is, and everything that happens is just emanates from this, right? One can even argue that the concept of truth itself is a transcendent concept, right? In a matter that it does not exist in the world, but we sort of look to it to derive sort of stability to our concepts. And but that comes in the postmodern critique of modernist philosophy. We are not now even begin with the modernist philosophy, so let's not get ahead of us. But yeah, I want you to understand this the divide between Plato and Aristotle. That is a divide of transcendence versus this idea of empirical reality. The world around us is just what it is. Immanence, right? Immanence, I think, is a very loaded word. I think we should not use it right now, but yeah, I think that sort of explains Aristotle and Plato's perspectives. Anything else?
So you talked about deductive reasoning, okay, and I think we all are aware of that, but I couldn't really get what inductive reasoning means. So if you could just explain that a bit.
Yeah, anyone would like a shot at explaining what inductive reasoning is, so that I just see, if like I communicated like that properly. Even if you like have a prior understanding of what inductive reasoning is, please go ahead.
So let's say, Anukia, you're walking around your colony and you see an animal called a dog. And you see that the dog has four legs. So you're like, okay, cool. Then you move on and you see another dog, and that dog also has four legs. And you're like, all right, that's cool. This also has four legs. And you move on, and let's say you see like 50 dogs in a day, and all of them have four legs, right? So you make, so from that observation, sort of, that okay, there's 50 dogs with four legs, you make the conclusion that look, I've looked at so many dogs, all of them have four legs. Therefore, it must be true that dogs, at least in my colony, have four legs, right? You could even make a larger assumption that all dogs in the world have four legs. So I mean, so it's inductive in that sense that you made an observation and now you're deducing that okay, because of this observation, I've seen that a lot of dogs have four legs. In fact, every dog that I've seen has four legs. Therefore, dogs around me must have four legs. So, yeah.
So basically, if I can combine it in a simple sentence, it's just that inductive. It's a prediction that draws some kind of conclusion about a future instance from your sample that you have collected or generated in past. So this is a kind of generality. Like this is what inductive reasoning is. What Ayan is trying to say.
Yeah, basically, if I have to explain a difference in one line, I'd say that deductive reasoning has general principles as truth, and then and then it takes out specific truths from the general truth, right? And the inductive reasoning does the opposite, that it has specific truths, and from that it comes to arrive at a general truth, right? And of course, as you can sense, right, that deductive reasoning will always be correct. If the general rule is correct, then the specific truth will always be correct. But yeah, there is a possibility that when you sort of move in the opposite direction, you move from specific to general, there's a chance that there is always a mismatch, right? That the general truth you arrive at might not be always true, and there might be some sample that you fail to notice which sort of defeats this general truth. So, for example, if one morning you sort of wake up and see a dog walking on two legs, right, that will sort of defeat your understanding of dogs having four legs, right? So all it just takes is a one contrary example to defeat the general rule that has been established by inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is what modern science engages in. So of course, it sort of raises some epistemological questions about our science today, how reliable it is, and of course, science does not claim to know the absolute truth about things, right? That is not what science does. Science paints a useful picture of reality. Maths, on the other hand, is deductive reasoning. So whatever math says is the truth, it's the deductive truth, right? So yeah, I think that is a good way to explain like in deductive and inductive reasoning. Other questions or additions that anyone likes to make, questions about other theories? Let's move away from logic for a bit. Other theories, can you talk about Nicomachean ethics and politics? Right. Nicomachean ethics. Like, has anyone been like, has anyone like sort of acquainted themselves with the like Aristotle's view on ethics and politics, like other than the notes? Notes were not, just gave an overview of what the Nicomachean ethics and politics were based on. It did not go into detail because I thought that they were like very extensive views, and Nicomachean ethics like runs into 10 books, right? So we would need a separate discussion on it altogether if we need to do, because just like we did in the Republic I did because it's like a very important text. It's a very fundamental text from where all this political and like ethical and this transcendent, all these most of Plato's doctrines originate or are explained in that. But I don't think that Nicomachean ethics, like having a separate discussion on it, would be that fruitful as Republic, because it just talks about the ethics. It doesn't talk about anything else. But yeah, yeah, we can surely discuss Nicomachean ethics and politics a bit here. Like, if anyone has any idea, like, if anyone remembers something from Maheshwar sir's class, or anything like that, please go on. Feel free to, I mean, put it across. But like, let's draw from one of the lectures, like, lectures, right? Like, where he talked about, Aristotle, of course, he talked about, like, in a sort of an introductory manner. He talked a lot about, liberal theorists, right, and their focus on the individual. Locke talks about the natural rights of the citizens, right? The individual is important for him, right? Rousseau doesn't think that, doesn't think that we are part of a sort of a community, like, and something. We just solitary beings, and each one of us are in like an ocean in themselves, an island in themselves, right? But Aristotle's views, of course, were very different from these theorists. He believed, on the other hand, like, the focus. Yeah, Nandini, you were saying something?
No, I was just drawing the attention to the fact that Aristotle and the other social contractarians, they were in two different time frames.
Mhm.
So Aristotle was during, I think, 300 BC somewhere, and these contractarians, they were there during the time of revolution, where there was this feeling of nationalism, French Revolution time. So there's a two different mentalities involved. Aristotle was at a time where conquest, because he was even the teacher of Alexander the Great. So there was a time when there were conquest and expansion of states, territories. Concept of state wasn't developed yet. However, when we come to this point of social contractarians, there's a totally completely different mindset, because they're trying to evolve this concept of state, nationalism, people's rights. So I think two different mindsets involved in these ways. So
Exactly. Well pointed out, Nandini. Of course, in Aristotle's time, we did not have concepts of larger nations and states or whatever. Of course, the unit of, Aristotle's philosophy was the polis, right? Or, which we today might call the city state. And that was the political unit, right? We did not have countries, of course. We had city state, which had its own rule, which had its own norms. We had Athens, Macedonia. All of these places had their own rulers and their own forms of government. So right. So what Aristotle, both Aristotle and Plato sort of focus their politics on the conception of the from the idea of a city state. And of course, for Aristotle, that is the unit of political involvement. The way the virtues and that the polis embodies was what was important to Aristotle. It was not the individual, right? However, Aristotle does focuses on some aspects of distributive justice, right? That the polis should be ruled along just lines, right? That there should not be a huge disparity of resources, right? There should be equal, sort of, not equal, but sort of a uh, uh, justly divided resources in the polis, right? Of course, that does not mean equal division of resources, because again, aristocrats will deserve more resources than the plebeians, right? In that sense, plebeians will deserve more amenities and resources than the slaves, right? So of course there is hierarchy here, but at the same time, there is, like, the hierarchy should not be unjust, right? For example, we cannot give a plebeian more like resources than an aristocrat, right? Or we cannot just bridge the gap between aristocrat and plebeian so much that the plebeian cannot even live their life, right? So of course there is a division there, but at the same time, there is like a notion of distributive justice there, but that distributive justice isn't tantamount to equality, right? Our modern liberal notions of what equality is, or what justice is. Justice, and as we saw in Plato's Republic, meant a very different thing to these people, right? Like, than it would be to us. Like, for them, it is the most good that you can sort of do in the world. How do you know what is good? You go to the forms of good, and try to sort of embody that form of good in the individual, in the state, and sort of you do this kind of mental gymnastics to sort of arrive at a just state. Aristotle, on the other hand, had also a conception of justice that was that assumed the form of rulership, that said that, oh, the form of rulership must be correct. It doesn't matter, exactly. It doesn't really matter what, for example, of course, Plato gives like a like a hierarchy of like a hierarchy of rules which are the best, right? Aristocracy is the best, democracy is the worst, right? We don't see this sort of plain hierarchy given in Aristotle. He sort of constructs this, like it doesn't matter what exactly the composition of the city state is, there is always a correct form of the state and there is always a wrong form of state, right? I think I gave this sort of table there, that the correct form of the correct form is of one person ruling is aristocracy, wrong form is tyranny. Of some people ruling, the wrong form is oligopoly, and the right form is, I think it was in the notes, right? But the wrong form of yeah, I'll just read out the notes here. So if one ruler is there, kingship
Democracy,
is the
right?
correct. Yeah. So sorry,
Mhm.
one ruler is there, kingship is the correct, tyranny is the deviant form. When few rulers are there, aristocracy is the correct form, oligarchy is the deviant form, and when many rulers are there, polity is the correct form, and democracy is the deviant form. Democracy, of course, not the modern like liberal democracy like the that it existed in Athens, right? That it's just a fish market. Everyone is like doing whatever they want, and there's no everyone is just doing like deceiving each other using rhetorics for sophism for these means that are not necessarily just. So that is what he means by democracy. I think that is what, of course. Hi, welcome back, Nitai. We're discussing Aristotle's politics on Akshay's request. um okay. As quick to come as quick to leave. Anyway, yeah, so that is where Aristotle draws his conception of politics from. Yeah, I think that suffices, like the discussion about politics. If anyone has more questions, might pertaining to ethics, but I would like to focus on some other theories, right? There are some problems that we highlighted in the theory of four causes. There are some problems in these, so I think that was like I thought that would be more of a point of discussion rather than politics and Nicomachean ethics.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that. So, right, okay. So, okay, first, like I'll ask a few clarifying questions so that just that I know that I'm sure about this. So, for example, okay, a wheel is a phenomenon, right? But a circle is not because a circle is an abstract concept. Okay, so a pond, for example, is a phenomenon, but is water one? If I just say water, because water isn't an abstract concept,
Hmm.
right? But is water a phenomenon? You can't say it's an abstract concept because it's made up of substance. Water is made up of water. But then is the material cause of water water? So is this? I am genuinely confused about this. So where do you
Yeah,
put water?
that is a good question, right? When we're talking about the but like the causes, like the efficient and the final cause of material causes, the things that constitute the material cause themselves, right? We sort of run into trouble. I mean, we can talk about ice, right? Ice has a final cause that we use it to cool things. It has an efficient cause. It has a freezer. It has the efficient cause, right? There's a formal cause, says of the shape of cubes or whatever. It has a material cause that is water. But just go back to
Exactly. Like,
water. What
well,
is
like, if
water?
the material cause of something is the same as the thing, and it isn't an abstract concept, then
Hmm.
it also isn't an exception listed, like at least according to the notes. So
Okay, so
what is that exception?
That is a very good question, and thank you very much. This is the sort of mental gymnastics I like to do in philosophy club meetings, right? Sort of, like trying to pick apart the theories of these philosophers in interesting ways. Does anyone has any I mean, you guys can go back to the notes on the four causes and sort of, have it in front of you, open to sort of, do this exercise. Would anyone like to? Hi, Debayan, you have your mic open. If
Yes, perhaps you can say that the material cause of water is rainfall, probably.
what?
Rainfall or maybe
That
ice,
that may
something.
be the efficient cause. I'm not sure that will be the material cause.
And then you
No,
can say the
like
efficient
it
cause
will be
is like fire or something, or heat.
Hmm. Would you like to consider the existence of water as a coincidence? I mean
not a
coincidence in
coincidence.
I mean coincidence in a very Aristotelian sense, right? That it sort of doesn't always have a final cause. Does it have a final cause? I'm
Yeah, I
confused.
mean, okay, what is the final cause of water in the ocean? I mean, it's
Nimal
just
has
there.
Nimal, I think, wants to take a guess.
Give the fishes a home. Yes,
Yeah, no, I think like we can attribute a final cost to water, right? Because we use it like water is something like all living organisms use. So maybe its final cost is to be used by like living things.
Yeah, yeah, smart, Nimal, smart observation. A
Okay, then
clever
why can't
observation.
you create like bottled water as a separate thing?
Bottled water is
I'm
a
just asking
different
you for,
thing.
let's say, oceanic water in general.
No, so bottled water's material cause is water, but then what is the material cause of that water? I mean,
Do you have
you
some?
could say hydrogen oxygen combining, but
Yeah, you
then
could
what
say
is
two hydrogen and oxygen
then what is the material cause of a hydrogen atom? In fact,
atoms.
what is the distinction between the form and the matter of an atom? Like a hydrogen atom's form is one atom, its matter is one atom. Although I don't know that much chemistry, so I might be wrong.
I think we can say that the atoms of like like a water molecule are the matter like material cause, and the bonds that it makes sort of can be said to be the formal cause. Yes,
Jyotsna
Jyotsna,
has
yes,
a
molecules. Yes, yeah. For life to exist, we
Yeah,
need
so
everything.
the question which Ayan raised, the atom can also change its form by combining with other atoms, but its matter will still remain the same, or shared vice versa, something like that. But like it can bond with others, so something will change, but at least its internal identity, the example which Abhineet
Yeah.
explained in his notes.
Mm. I would
True
like,
sense like
yeah,
that.
I would like to sort of, like pause here and sort of, this focus on the parallel that has been drawn here with the idea of, the material cause remaining same while the formal cause change, and the, idea that, matter can neither be created nor be destroyed, classical chemistry ka jo ek wo hai. So, how the modern science, sort of, took and developed the concepts of ancients, right, to sort of reach the understanding that they have today, right? So yeah,
In
interesting.
that term, like we can say, because it was a discussion between matter and atom, right? So atom is the smallest unit that is made up of matter. So like this is the layman, like we used to distinguish between, and it's not also like completely true,
Oh, you
because
have
atoms
quarks.
also contain matter, right?
You have quarks as well, which are of different
Yeah,
types.
exactly.
but
So it was how we used to describe what the smallest unit was previously. But after that, there were several charged particles, the boson particle, the quarks, the protons, neutrons. So, like, okay, so I guess we are not, at that level. Like, see, this is the thing, right? Because it keeps like shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and now we are back to like there are different, if we are going into the science, like not concerning but philosophy, if we are moving into the science realm, now the topic is about the theory of string theories, right? So now the people are saying that the smallest particles are basically strings, okay, which are connected. Okay, so now this is the smallest thing. Now this is the smallest particle. So, and after that, maybe like in the theoretical realm, in the theoretical, like the thing is that we can't prove like what is the smallest thing, because our mind can only, we can only like in the theory part we can say that yeah, the whole of the universe are made up of strings. And now the concepts deriving out of this string theory is that there are several dimensions in which different type of string arrangements are there. So you guys, I will highly recommend to just go and search about the string theory. Okay, so now the basically the thing is that now what's the uh, you know now the question is, what is the smallest thing in the entire universe? So if we can find that smallest thing, then our life will be a hell lot easier. But the thing is that I don't think so. Like, it's dating back to like Thales of Miletus, like in the 624 BC. He was the one, I guess, if I'm sure or not, like he was the one who first asked this question, that what is the basic material of the cosmos, and then he derived to the conclusion that everything is made up of water. So like from that point of time and till date, we are still trying to find out what is the basic thing. And like, yeah.
Nice segue that we have to Thales of Miletus. Thank you, Anand. The first philosopher to ever exist. I talked about him in the first Philocram meeting, remember?
I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Thales of Miletus. And yeah, let's just like go back from Socrates a bit to some Endoxa that existed in his time. regarding atomism, right? Can anyone tell me who was the philosopher who came up with the concept of atoms? It was. Guess, any guess? Collective confusion this has ensued. It was a Greek philosopher. It was a pre-Socratic philosopher, in fact, that came up with the idea of atom. If anyone would like to take a guess.
No, I mean, I can do a drum roll and you can say the answer.
Anyway, so yeah,
I
it
can't
was.
remember the pronunciation and the name, but it was something like demo, like
Yeah. You're close, Anand. Okay, so it was Democritus, right? And
Very interesting.
yeah, we studied that in chemistry. The हमारी जो atom वाला chapter था उसके शुरू में लिखा रहता था कि Greek philosopher Democritus came up with the idea of atoms, if you remember. So if you go to any quiz, I think this is like a good question that you can remember. It was Democritus who came up with the idea that all that exists is atoms and void, right? And I think and of course with this idea of atoms and this atoms and void is something that derived from his material reductivism, which is like okay, you break a thing in two, right? You break that thing into and what is the smallest unit that you will reach? There is a point that you cannot go to the infinite regress, right, in that manner, because infinite regress we cannot do that. We highlighted when we were discussing the problems with Plato's idea of forms in Parmenides' dialogue, last meeting, I guess, like last meeting only. So yeah, so in this week, guys, what are the problems with infinite regress, right? We cannot go infinitely downward. So that is the theory that reductive atomism came from. How will you divide the atom? What's the smallest part that you will reach? You will reach a point where where you cannot divide it any further, and at that point you have reached an atom, right? For him, like for Democritus, atom was the smallest divisible part. So he famously said that the universe is nothing but atoms and void, right? So so the fundamental like matter, like fundamental unit of matter was like like an atom. I think later theorists, however, came, I don't know if it was Aristotle or someone who like then questioned the idea of Democritus, and like as to, okay, you say that the world is atoms and void, right? So like there is like atom, so what is between the atom? That there is void, but void is also something, right? And you say that if all things are made of matter, then the void must also be made of like atoms. And since that can't happen, then you'll need to explain what is the between the interstices of that void, like the atoms of that void. And so this is where this Democritus sort of reasoning sort of falls apart for the Greek like philosophers. And of course, like we have like of course deviated a bit from the formal cause and the material cause discussion of water, but yeah, I think it is like a good segue that we took. I mean, of course there is a lot of endoxa that we can rely on that was not probably available in Aristotle's time in trying to figure out what the material cause of water is, right? But at the end of the day, I think there are certain, because that again goes back. Yeah, Anand, you were saying something.
Yeah, so what I was saying, that we have to appreciate, like, in the context in which like those thinkers were thinking, like it was the archaic period, right? And in that point of time, there were and the first branch was the metaphysics branch, like from the Thales of Miletus. And we obviously like because we are so enamored by Greek philosophers, that we credit like Democritus for conceptualizing this theory of atom and all. But the real thing is that if we are looking at the Indian texts also, like there was a philosopher named Kannada, right? He was the first one who used in his texts like the theory of atoms and all. So, and he was like 2nd century BC, if I'm not wrong. So it was very old. So what I'm trying to say, that the philosophy and science, uh, those both of these things are so closely associated that the first philosophy is also like in the branch of metaphysics and monoism and all. So yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, there's like a clear distinction between science and philosophy only came about like in this, 17, 18, late 17, 18th century, right? It did not exist as such before. Like, for example, we study, Newton was a scientist, but as I've said, I think in the opening discussion is that, what the designation that he held at the university was, he was a professor of natural philosophy, right? Science and all this physics and all that came under the branch of natural philosophy. So yeah, of course, it was very later that this entire thing, distinction between science came, and the philosophy then was just relegated to sort of these metaphysical ideas, metaphysical epistemological ideas, right? So it happened very later. But as far as at that time we're concerned, when we talk about philosophy, talk about everything, right? All knowledge just plainly comes under philosophy. Yeah,
Like
yeah, Anand.
my professor once used to say, like he was my mentor. He used to say that it might be like each and every philosophers are not related to science or a scientist, but every scientist is somewhat a philosopher, right? So yeah, I get that point.
Jyotsna, you have a question. I think would you like to like ask it?
Yeah, not like a question, but a deduction I made from the discussion we had, that material cost for everything at the end is like atom. So it is kind of obvious if we discuss about anything, its material cost would be an atom at the uh, last part, or if we even uh, go deep into science, so atom could divide kar sakte hai. So what is the need of discussing the material cost if it is same for everything that
No,
exists?
like I think we can draw I think we can draw a distinction between what we understand in science as the atom and what Aristotle would have understood then. Like even when Democritus was talking about atoms, what he meant was like an undivisible thing, right? Like you can divide a piece of wood into smaller and smaller bits. Eventually, you reach the point where it can't be divided. It's that small. So if atoms are those tiny, undivisible things, then what is the material cause of those undivisible things? So without going into the science of yes, an atom can be split and so on, as we understand today, at one point you reach something which cannot be divided further. So what is the material cause of that thing? It will only be a loop, right? Like the material cause of the smallest unit of water which cannot be divided will be water itself. So
Basically, like what Ayan is trying to say that the
Anand, could you get closer to the mic?
yeah, so what Ayan is trying to say at this point of time is like Meletus first must have asked this question, that what is the basic material of the cosmos, right? So basically, it must be like something from which everything can be formed. Like it must be essential to life. It must be capable of some kind of motion, and it must be capable of some kind of change. Okay. And by this logic, Meletus arrived at a conclusion that everything is made up of water. And you must have to, if you, and I know that it can't be, accepted in today's world, but we have to look the time period in which he was forming this concept. Okay. And to be honest, we didn't have like, anything of him like writing, like his writings isn't available as of, I don't think so. Like any of his writing is survived, like they all are destroyed at this point of time. But he must have had asked this question at that point of time. His era was around 624 546 BC. Okay, so he must have asked these questions like, what is the basic material of the cosmos? And it was the first attempt, if I may say, that it was the first attempt at a unified theory, right? He wanted to create a theory that can explain each and every bit, like be it science or be it philosophy. So he wanted to, just cut it down to the smallest part. So this was his basic reasoning behind finding the material fact. So yeah. And to be honest, he was the first philosopher, and Thales of Miletus, maybe people might not agree with him, but like he was the, like, in some way, a foundation of like science and critical thinking was laid down by him at that point of time. So yeah, if you can just look at that way. Yeah, that's all
Yeah,
I
of
would.
course. I mean, like even all of these ancient philosophers we discuss, why do we discuss them? It's not because their ideas hold a very great relevance in today's world, but because the ideas that we hold today somewhere evolved from these ideas, right? So that is why we discussed today. I think Jyotsna's question was, I think, pretty much answered. What I like what An was basically saying is that atom, and I think Ayan also said that, is that atom is basically the smallest part of the real material cause, that is the wood, right? The atom of a wood is at the end of the day still wood. So it's just material cause is the entire thing instead of the smallest part of that thing, right?
So I just wanted to like maybe bring in another dimension to this discussion on the theory of causes. So something that was bugging me and something that I couldn't understand was that how this theory of causes, and especially the efficient cause and and the final cause played into Aristotle's idea of God in theology, because Aristotle states that he doesn't believe in a creative God, right? He believes that the God exists to put everything in motion, but especially with respect to things that are not man-made and not created by man, essentially, how do you play that in with the efficient cause and the final cause of thing? Because if you think about it, to think of things that are not man-made, to have an efficient cause and a final cause, it presupposes a creator, right? But Aristotle doesn't believe in a creative God. So how does that work with it? I didn't really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I understood your question, Nitai. So I'll just add like some context to what he's saying about Aristotle's theological views. Right? They're not strictly theological, but of course, that comes to his conception of God or whatever, right? So Aristotle, of course, we discussed first principles, right? In Aristotle's physics, there is a similar discussion as into okay, everything that moves, it moves because of a mover, right? Everything that has been if you push something, it touches other things, and it touches other things, and that is why things move in general, is because they have been like moved by initial mover, right? For example, even the food that we eat, it gives us the energy, and sort of which is like of course, like, which is grown by farmers, and it just sorts of has that sort of energy that we today call it has chemical energy, that the way that teachers used to use the concept of energy to students is that this had chemical energy, we consume it, then we have kinetic energy because we move around, right? So basically there is something that is happening, that is that sort of asks us to beg the question, what came before that, what came before that, what came before that, right? So Aristotle wants us to think about who was the first mover, right? First mover from which all motion begins, and all the existence is basically set into motion. So of course he does not believe in a creative God. Nitai said, pointed out correctly, is that because he did not believe that God like meticulously created everything, as Christians believe in, like uh, the intelligent design, they call it, right? So Aristotle, of course, did not believe in this thing. He just believed that something caused the world to first come into motion, and it has been going on ever since, right? And like things have been happening with a series of cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, that is happening, and it sort of explains everything, right? So who was the first mover? What was the characteristic of the first mover? How do we arrive at the first mover? That was what Aristotle was trying to figure out. I think open to discussion, man. It's an interesting topic.
Basically, like it left a very it left an influence. The influence of Aristotle on the history of thought can be seen like in the, if you guys have read or not, I don't know, but the great Chan of being, right? A medieval like Christian depiction of life as a hierarchy in which with God presides over all. So this is how like the Christianity also takes like the Aristotle like thought of process, like just dating it down to like what was the first thing, right? And the Christians, for them, the first thing was obviously like the God and all. So they created a great chain of beings. So yeah, that was also an influence of Aristotle's thought at that point of time on religion. So
Again, I guess this reminds me of Aquinas as well, because one of his theories for God is like motion, and every motion is caused by a motion that came before that. And you go all the way back, and then he's like, hey, this is proof that God exists.
Nice. We have a module on like medieval philosophy. We'll cover Aquinas. Aquinas was an interesting guy. First natural law theory was also given by Aquinas. But like pertaining to Aristotle's first mover, thing. Uh, a question that can be asked is whether the nature of the first mover is rationally knowable. It's just just throw around what the nature of this god or first mover is, or like basically ontological questions regarding to the nature of the first mover or whatever. I'm just asking a basic epistemological question. Do you think that it is possible for us, using human faculties, whatever we have, we do science, dialectics, observation, reason, whatever, do you think that the nature of the first mover is rationally or empirically or whatever, in whatever way, it is knowable? Can humans know the nature of the first mover? That is the question. I think that is more interesting in this part rather than the nature of the first mover itself. Please. try to make conjectures, guesses. I mean, this is like a metaphysical question that has no open answer, right?
You opened the Pandora's box. Yes. Straight up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
really good.
it is good to. This is like, of course, of course, there is. See, this is the manner in which like these ancient philosophers help us, right? Because whatever their idea of God is, like that doesn't conform to our modern world. So how what is the need for it? It's the thought process that we can take, and we can like sort of take questions from that and sort of try to use it to answer some to as a thought process to sort of understand our reality and and our epistemological question that I think that might intrigue us today, right? So I want you guys to focus and not just like discuss a little bit about what do you think, like is the nature of the first mover knowable? If yes, if no, whatever your answer is, why do you think so? Some basis like doesn't have to be perfect, because there are no perfect answers to this, so you will not be marked, or because there's no correct answer, so there are no marks. So go ahead, just shoot whatever you want to say.
If I may, like, uh, in the next discussion, or whenever we will discuss this topic, just before finding like who was the first mover, just try to find out what causes that movement. Like, the question that what's the mover, like what moves the stone. For example, Aristotle used it in that context, like if a stick is what moves the stone, but in another way the man is, since the stick is moved by the man. So like that, you can also like that thought process will also help you to
Yeah,
reach
see,
this.
see, that's the problem, right? That's the problem with the question of the first mover, Anand, right? Is that we can always, go behind something, right? But the problem of first mover is that which caused the first motion, right? How do we sort of go there, right? And that also ties in with Aristotle's conception of time, right? That there should be, like there's a timeline of things as to, we go before and before and before and before. But the problem is, right, what is at the beginning of time? You know, we can in a way ask like what came before time, but before is also like a temporal like qualifier, right? It talks in terms of time. So we cannot ask even the question what came before time, because time is what gave the idea of before even some reality, right? Some meaningfulness. So that is the problem with the question of time and question of motion. And these things are like very closely related, because Aristotle sort of ties in this idea of time and motion. For him, like these are like pretty much to like things that explain each other, right? He sort of explains time in context to motion, right? How far a thing has moved, right? In a certain, so that is where his idea of time came from, and that was a very dominant idea of time till the time of Kant. you know Immanuel Kant is famous for separating like the separating time as an independent concept from motion, but we'll cover that when we discuss Kant, right? But for now, Aristotle sort of ties in the concept of motion and time, and sort of like the beginning of time is also where the first mover originated, right? So I think, because if there is no movement, then there is no time for Aristotle, right? So when
Yeah,
the
I think
first mover moved the thing, then also time began. So I think these are the two questions you can discuss.
yeah, I think what Aristotle means by that is I mean even today a lot of us say time is change, right? Like why is time passing? Because things around us are changing. Now let's say hypothetically there's a situation where everything stops. Like the popular, I don't know if you've seen X-Men, but there's that scene, right, when the bald guy stops everything and it's like time stopped. So what really happens? What happens when we say that time stopped? It's because all of the change which was happening, it was accruing, stopped. So let's say that there's a ball which is rolling and then suddenly it stops. Like it stops changing its position. Then you would say, oh yeah, time stopped. Because there's no change happening. So how do you know if it's the past, present, or future? Because the ball is just sitting there. Anyway, yeah, so I think with the beginning of time began when change began. So let's say that the universe is just set as it is. For a million years, there's no changing in it. Not a single atom is moving. How can you distinguish between that universe at different points of time? You can't, because it's the same thing. So there's no time which is there as such. So time began when change began. So I think Aristotle's question was more like when did the universe first change and how did it first change? And to be honest, I don't feel like there's really a way of answering that. I mean, you can't answer that via induction for sure, because I don't think there's any reliable observation that you can make which will lead you to the answer. Like you can't say, okay, I see stars moving, probably that star moved first. Anything like that. I don't think there's any observation you could make which will tell you what the first movement was. I don't think you can answer it via deduction either, because there's no general principle for that. I really feel like it's an unanswerable
You
question.
know, yeah, and then basically we can surely like if we are going like like billions of years ago, like while the Big Bang theory itself, like so if you are also like thinking about that, so Big Bang theory is all about like gases and all. So very heated like gas particles, they collided and then the universe was formed. So who put into the motion those particles, right? And after that, if there is a collision also, like it's ever expanding. So like scientists are trying to explain it in a way like there is a dark matter, right? So it's the reason behind the motion of each and every matter. So it's expanding. The two-dimensional like time frame is expanding. So scientists are trying to answer but they can't, like it's very, because they can predict like this is the thing which is causing the motion, but they can't answer the question about what's the first motion caused by, what was the factor behind the first motion. So it's very difficult, and yeah, it surely is interesting too.
I mean, I think when you put it like when you put philosophy in terms of these huge like space-time concepts, then there's a lot of interesting questions like come up. Like, like the universe is expanding, but expanding where? Where is the universe going? And if
And
it's expanding
talking about
somewhere,
this,
then there was
yeah,
already a universe
and
there.
it's expanding like basically what like if you are even asking a question, if you are even asking this question to a small kid, if you are saying that this thing is expanding, he must say that yeah, it's expanding in the air, it is expanding on my bed or whatever. So for expansion you need another space which is bigger than that expanding matter or expanding thing. So what's that space, what's that space feels like? And after that, scientists are also saying that there are numerous universes. So for those things to exist, there must be a space. So after that space and that space, so where does this end? And our mind is too tiny and too small to comprehend these things in their entirety. So we
I
might
mean,
have to
yes.
have like infinite number of philosophy clubs, but we won't be able to answer these fundamental questions like you know so yeah.
And yeah, before I think we move on, I think Ian talked about where the sort of universe is expanding. Like I'm not an expert in like cosmology by any manner, and but because it sort of ties with these philosophical questions, that is why I sort of looked it up. And the present consensus, I think, among cosmologists is, if I'm not wrong, I might be misquoting them because that's not my area of expertise, right? Cosmology. But I think the way that what scientists, cosmologists use to sort of explain the expansion of the universe is that they give the analogy of a balloon, right? And imagine that the air inside it is time, and the surface area of it is the space, right? So when we blow air in the balloon, right, so that is like the time is passing, right? The time, again, as the air inside it is going, so we imagine it as the time is passing. What is happening is that its surface area is increasing, right? So cosmologists try to help, just ask us to understand the expansion of the universe in this manner, that the area of it is like there's no thing in itself which the universe is expanding, because there's no thing beyond the universe, right? It is expanding in and of itself, is that it's that the fabric of space and time is like elongating itself, right? So that is the manner in which cosmology. I of course I do not clearly understand this theory, because it just goes into a
It's
lot of
very simple,
cosmological
right?
details.
So time is expanding and time is moving in a direction. It's like, just imagine a dot. Okay. So dot is zero dimensions. It doesn't have any dimension. Just place infinite number of dots. It will create a line. It will create a line. It's one dimensional. Now use a thing and just add lines and lines and lines and then infinite numbers of line, and then it's two dimensional. After that, putting two-dimensional objects, you will get three dimensions. Okay. So like if you are placing, like just imagine the two dimension is the sheet, a sheet of paper, and then just put infinite number of two-dimensional sheets, you will get a three dimension. So we come to a conclusion that three dimension is what? Height, breadth, and length. But what about the fourth dimension? And this is the main problem. This is where scientists, you know, just theorize what time is. Because now they are saying that, okay, so we know what three dimension is. Now let's just put three dimension pieces together. Now the finicky thing starts. Okay. So when you put a hell lot of three-dimensional objects, you will still get a three-dimensional, a 3D object only. Okay. So now scientists for this answer, they are trying to say that the fourth dimension must be time. Okay. And now just imagine that we are living in a four-dimensional time-space continuum, right? So basically, what scientists try to, what theoretical physicists try to tell us is that what we are living on, the Earth. Let's take that for an example. So the Earth is a three-dimensional thing. Okay, the Earth is a three-dimensional object, which is placed on a two-dimensional sheet of time. Okay. So have you seen those those images in which below the earth there are like graphs and all, graphs are put and on that earth is put, right? तुम लोगों ने शायद देखा या नहीं देखा? It's like it's about there is a two-dimensional graph and on that each and every planet is kept. Okay. So they are so they are trying to explain that this two-dimensional thing is now time, and this time and space continuum is four-dimensional continuum. So it's more of a theoretical physicist thing. So we won't dive into those details, but it's very interesting. Like if we ever have a meeting on just talking about the theoretical physics, it will be very you guys will see all of the theoretical physics. In fact, be it Neil deGrasse Tyson or any theoretical physicist for that example, they all took their cues from the philosophers like Aristotle, the metaphysics philosophers, or from the philosophers like Thales of Miletus and all. So they are just doing one thing: they are expanding their own those thought processes of those philosophers, right? So they are just expanding on that. They are just thinking on that, and voila, you get like a whole new branch of science, that is theoretical physics. So it's nothing but philosophy of science in that manner.
Actually, there is an entire branch of philosophy that deals with this. It's called philosophy of science. There are like two aspects of philosophy of science, which analyzes science's methods, its validity, and all that stuff, right? And there's another aspect of philosophy of science that deals with the metaphysical implications of these physical laws that we arrive, right? For example, scientists of the olden days, they used to observe the world around us, and on basis of that observation, they used to philosophize, right? Now the observations, the scientific observation, have become so complex that if you need to dabble into the philosophical implications of this entire this entire field of body of thought like quantum physics or relativity, then you need to know these topics as well. So there is considerable work which talks about metaphysical implications of quantum mechanics, which talks about the metaphysical implications of theory of relativity. And if you guys want, I can share some interactive link. I have like some podcast links or some things like that, some videos or whatever, to which sort of talk about these things. It's really interesting, and I really like to sort of bring in science in philosophical discussion, especially when we're talking about physical reality, because again, at the end of the day, this is what our present understanding is, and all philosophical norms, if we are going to build them, it is pertinent that we build them on these understandings. Like, we can get bogged down in sort of Aristotle's own philosophy and just sort of try to discuss whatever Aristotle talked about, but then there's no point of discussion, right? If we're just going to just talk about what Aristotle talked about, right? Because at the end of the day, Aristotle was like limited by his understanding. So what if we use the Aristotelian method, and if we use the question that Aristotle asked, right, to in today's context, that is in itself a fruitful activity, in my opinion, right? Because the questions were the questions then, they're the questions now. They might have become like old, because in the context, in the way we talk about things, right? Aristotle framed the question as what was the first mover, right? But we would rather like frame it as how did universe begin, right? Question is the same, just the form of it changes, right? Because depending on the knowledge of that time,
Matter and form, right?
whatever.
Matter is the same, the form changes.
And
Isomorphism of concept. Yes, I am the metaphysician.
Bro, but
yeah.
yeah.
No, and go on.
I was saying that we went on quite a tangent. I'll just come like a bit back to the four causes, because I had two questions. like which I wanted to discuss. So the first question, they both pertain to the final cause of something, right? So my first question was, is the final cause of something subject to different definitions or interpretations? For example, let's say that I have a compost pit in my garden. Okay. Now, for me, the final cause is I can dump my chopped vegetables and all of that into the pit. Right. For an earthworm, the final cause of it is it's a great source of food for them. For a bird, the final cause is yeah, it's a toilet. Like there's a hole in the ground, it's a toilet for me. For the tree, the final cause of that is it's a pit which gives a lot of nutrition and I can grow, and so on. Okay. The first question is, can there be different maybe they are chill Chopra. Are there different interpretations of the final cause? But more importantly, do you think the second question, do you guys think that this changes Aristotle's theory, or this is in any way like like diminishes what Aristotle's theory is?
Ayan, you have entered the forbidden territory now.
Yes, I have.
You have asked a question that will be taken up by later philosophers, and it will become a whole matter of contention. I'll just explain the question that you have and what are its implications. But like, I just want to see if anyone wants to take a shot at it.
I think like this is the same, like the problem of coincidences which has been brought up. So if you're looking at the final cause of a particular entity, anything, so it is not always that it has only one purpose. It always has multiple purposes. So and that is for a flaw with, I believe, is a like real big flaw with Aristotle there.
Right. It's so
Yeah, but
interesting.
like, what defines that final cause? Like, okay, let's put aside the animals argument. Like, let's say humans are the most sentient creatures, and we shouldn't regard the final causes of anything by animals as actually final causes. So, if a bird thinks that a hole is meant for something, it doesn't matter to philosophy because we humans are key or whatever, right? But even for humans, the same thing will have different final causes.
Ayan, isn't it like Aristotle was trying to answer the why, right? So Aristotle's main reason for proposing the four causes theory, the matter, form, agency, and end or purpose, was basically to answer the a question of why. So this why must fluctuates from person to person and from creatures to creatures, right? So, like my general, my teeny tiny brain just answers this in a very, simple, you know, statement that this y fluctuates for each and every one of us. So, if with fluctuation, if with y the question is changing for each and every one of us, so must be the end or the purpose must be changing for each and every human being or creature. So they are interpreting their own why and they are trying to answer their own why in their own ways, right? So the answer is also changing according to them. So that's my
Wait, so if Aristotle is answering the why and saying that there's a purpose to everything, right? Okay, we know that people will perceive different purposes for something, for the same thing, right? But Aristotle is saying that everything has a purpose, like a side purpose. So is Aristotle now referring to some like transcendental purpose of something? Is this not transcendental? Is it not transcendental to say that something has one
Okay.
purpose?
Okay, yeah, and like I just like it's so funny. I'm so sorry, but like it's really, really interesting, and it's very amazing to see, how you guys have arrived at the, very base, and are asking the very basic questions that came in the mind of like philosophers who philosophize like very later, like existentialists are, the people
Yeah.
who ask the question that you're asking. Ayan. So you are an existentialist now. Congratulations. Okay, you're the first existentialist philosopher
I'm
of
not
any.
in bad company. I'm in good company.
Yeah, you're in good company. So let's explain the metaphysical implications of your question. You asked whether there are like one purpose that we can assign to a particular thing, right? What do we mean by when we ask the purpose of that thing, right? I mean, it is in some way related to the essence of that thing, right? We talked about essence, right? So essence closely ties with the purpose of that thing, right? So I'd like to just take the purpose question that you asked. I'd like to take it to a higher realm, right? I'll just take like एक level of abstraction ऊपर ले जाते हैं, right? Let's not ask you what the purpose of things can be different, right? Let's talk about in terms of essence. do we mean to say that the essence of things, and by extension its purpose, is always the same? Is that there is a predefined purpose, there's a predefined essence of something, which lies not in the real world, but something that precedes, our understanding of, like existence, right? So this is where we have the divide between essentialism and existentialism just, boiling up, right? Essentialists like Aristotle believed that the essence of a thing precedes its existence, right? Like essence exists before, and like then we have existence, because everything has a set defined essence to it, and by extension a set defined purpose to it, right? But existentialists would come later and ask the question in different, like, with looker, because by then, they, because of course they were arguing in different times, right? They were like talking in times where people still believed in God and whatever transcendence or ideas that they have, right? But in 19th century we're talking about a time when this all these concepts have lost currency, right? We have evolution to explain our universe in place in the universe, and we know that we're just pale blue dot in like whatever like a Carl Saganist interpretation of the world that we live in, right? So with that understanding, of course there is a shift of perspective, and then in the 20th century we have people asking, okay, wait, how do we say that these things have a similar purpose, right? There are different purposes for different beings, right? And yeah, I don't see what's my final cause. Yeah, so exactly. That is the question that interested the existentialist. For them, unlike Aristotle, of course, thought that the essence precedes existence. It comes before existence. जो existentialist थे, right? They believe no, it's not like that. Everything can have different purposes in different situations or whatever, right? There's no fixed purpose that has been allocated to that thing, and that is the purpose that it is going to serve, and that is the essence of that thing that is predefined, right? So for existentialist, existence comes first, essence comes later, right? Doesn't have this, there's no predefined purpose of anything. Purpose doesn't exist, pehle se. We have to sort of find it out. Then that question, what is the purpose of life? Like, what is the essence of life? I know, like, this doesn't exist already. Like, we believe that, God is there. There is like, this transcendent concept of, what is, what we have to do, what our purpose is. God said that we have to do this. God said we have to do that. And no, this is like bullshit. Just throw it out of the window. There's no purpose that is inherently defined. And then now let's just wonder what our purpose is, right? And as in, like, Nimal also pointed out, is that there are things that just don't have purpose, right? What if our life is like that? Like, our life is like a coincidence without a final cause, right? Then that sort of opens an entire can of worms that we did not expect before, right? Now what do we do? Then that, where Camus' idea of absurd comes in, right? That that everything is a coincidence, there's no final cause to things, and there's no ultimate essence and purpose to things. Everything just exists absurdly. Everything is a coincidence that just happened. There's no inherent meaning or essence to it, right? But that is something that we will discuss when we discuss. I mean, we can discuss existentialist a little bit now, but again, of course, if we don't have a purpose, what about the formal cause? I mean, formal cause exists. I mean, like, if you look around, formal cause of things exists, but like, of course, there is like questions that can be asked in that respect as well. I'll be more than happy if you raise them. But yeah, as far as our question of final cause and purpose and essence comes in, the Aristotelian understanding, of course, no longer serves as good, because we know that this everything is a scam. God is a scam, or that God is dead. Why? Because all this systems of support that we had, and we believing in a higher purpose, believing that has been ordained to us, that sort of thing disappeared in like by the 20th century, right? What we have is like it's just weird. Everything is weird. I mean, what to do now?
Honestly, that to say that there are ends, right, in nature is not to say that nature has a purpose. So basically Aristotle here is, I guess, he's not seeking some one answer to a question like what is the purpose of nature. From my point of view, he might be seeking a single kind of explanation, like of the characteristics and behavior of natural objects, right? That is like plants and animals develop and reproduce in like regular ways, the process involved, blah blah blah. And it also it and all of these like all of these behaviors might lead towards a certain end. So it
Hmm.
might be like, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, from Aristotle's point of view, it of course makes sense, right? Jyotsna, you don't need to raise hand. You can just just like unmute and speak.
Nee, I had a small doubt. So in your notes, you mentioned that humans have a need for sitting, and hence chair exists, and not the other way around. Like chair exists, and that is why we sit. So the
Hmm.
same way goes for other things as well. Like we should have a purpose, and that is why we exist, and not the other way around. That we exist, and hence we shall have a purpose. So there should
Hmm.
be a pre-existing purpose for our existence, and the same goes for, I think, water as well, as you were discussing in the beginning.
Hmm.
So
Jyotsna,
yeah,
what you're
that's
talking about, like realize the difference between like a purpose existing and a predefined purpose, right? Preordained purpose existing, right? That precedes existence, right? Like an existentialist would look at your question and argue, no, no, it's not that the chair had a predefined, like chair does not need a predefined purpose to exist as a chair, right? We can create that sort of purpose in it, right? For example, if we did not need like chairs to sit, if we were being that like a dog doesn't need a chair to sit, right? So if that reality, the chair doesn't have a preordained purpose, and and because in that reality the chair doesn't have a purpose, right? Because there's no need for chair, right? And there's no predefined purpose either, right? But humans need chairs to sit. So that is why the purpose of that chair is manufactured by us in that sense, right? We create the purpose of the chair by needing that chair. So in that sense, the what is happening is that the chair, all everything in relation to chair is happening in our own reality, and in our own existence, and there's no preordained thing that came before it, right? Nothing like a form of a chair, there's nothing like the essence of the chair that exists, right? So that is what we mean by essentialism and existentialism. Existentialism, all the purpose and everything is happening here only. Essentialism means ye pehle ho chuka hai, and we just just trying to figure things out instead of creating them, right? So yeah, so that is the Aristotelian, then that is a problem that exists even today, right? In people's thinking, right? People think in very essentialist ways in today's world, and that is a problem, right? Like there is like a preordained stuff, like for example, what is the problem with natural law? It's that it is an essentialist theory, right? It presupposes that there are something like natural right, that is the sort of result of the essence that sort of precedes existence, and that is why it is true, because it corresponds to like a reality that is not accessible to us, or whatever, like God or whatever, right? So that is essentialist thought, and I think that that is a topic that we sort of breached while discussing Amita ma'am, like Amita ma'am's class, I think. But she said that, oh, essentialism is a problem, but this is not the appropriate forum to discuss it. But that was LM class. This is philosophy club. This is the very correct forum to discuss it. So why not? Goddamn, discuss it.
Aristotle was
So,
so cool in that sense, like he didn't give a shit about the end. So for him, the final cause of a natural object was not a purpose, like plan or intention. Like rather for him, it was like, whatever lies at the end of the regular series of, developmental changes that typical specimen of a given species undergo. So those development might lead to a, final end or purpose. But yeah, so his thought process was very cool in that sense.
No, 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 no. I would disagree, because the way that we talk about, as well talked about teleology, is that whatever processes are happening, there are like final causes that are orienting it to it, right? So there is a goal that has been given by the purpose of that thing, and the formal material efficient causes is trying to reach it, right? So it would be incorrect to say that he doesn't give doesn't care about the form. It is that all the other causes sort of derive from that, right? That is the most important thing, and that is the point of teleology, right? You don't
Hmm.
focus on things that lead to something, you focus on the end itself. Yeah.
So basically,
bro, wait,
because I arrived at this conclusion because Aristotle opposes like yeah, so you can say this thing because yeah, I might be wrong because Aristotle also like opposes final causes in nature to like chance or randomness. So yeah, that might be like
He does talk about coincidences, right? Yeah.
yeah,
I,
sure.
yeah, wait. I don't know. I went on a little thought experiment while you guys were discussing it, and I don't know where I reached actually. I mean, I was just thinking for thinking's sake. Okay, so let's say that there's a painting. Okay. Okay, first like a clarification. There's a painting. What is the form of a painting? Okay, like okay, yeah. What is the form of a painting? Like, how do you distinguish the form of a painting from its matter? Okay, is my first like clarifying question. So let's say that there's a piece of canvas that I have. That is the form of the painting, right? And then the paint strokes that I make upon it are the matter. Okay, then okay, let's say that I'm an artist and I put a canvas in front of me and I start painting essentially, and I take breaks in between or whatever. Okay. Now the what are the four causes? Like first is the material cause. So let's say I make one stroke. Let's say I make a stroke like this. Okay. And that's painting number one. Okay. The material cause is paint and canvas. The formal cause is the canvas in which the painting is contained. Then there's the efficient cause, which is me, the artist, and then there's the purpose, because I want to paint. Okay, and then I make another like stroke, and now it's a completely different painting. And I said this is painting number two. However, the material cause is the same, so is the efficient cause. Even the formal cause is the same because it's the same canvas in which it's contained.
Yeah, I would say that
And
formal cause has changed, right? There is an extra formal cause, like form added
so,
to
so
it.
we okay. So the form of the painting is how. Okay, then what is the matter of the painting?
Matter of the painting is the paint, and like the paint and the way it is arranged is the formal cause. Like the shape of the whatever he's drawing is the formal cause. It's
Right,
leading
right,
to
right.
the form of the painting, right? I think that
Hmm.
clarified sort of the question. It's like
Yeah, yeah,
hylomorphism, dude. Like all change for Aristotle is hylomorphism. Is that
yeah,
there
yeah,
is
yeah,
like
yeah.
the form is changing. Yeah. What
Okay,
else?
I know.
This was
Yeah,
a
I mean, I
really
was thinking about this.
interesting meeting, right?
It is because it's a very interesting. Like I think the four causes, especially.
I have noted down like this discussion was too good, but I have to leave. But I can't
Oh yeah.
leave.
We just we're just
I
about to
have
close.
to
Like
go,
we're
but
like
I don't want to
almost
go.
2 hours. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, what like is there anything else would you like to ask? Like anything else we can discuss like before closing? Any concluding remarks or whatever anything you want to share before we close?
Okay, I mean, it was actually like really, really interesting. I think Aristotle, I think discussing metaphysics like in the context of Aristotle also opens up so many different arguments. Like you talk about material causes, and there's an entirely different argument. You talk about like what is the purpose of something, and existentialism comes up, this essentialism comes up, all that. So I think really like the base which Aristotle has laid, like so many arguments and so many different theories spring from that it's a really, really interesting discussion.
Hmm. All right, Divine.
Yeah, I guess this was a very fun discussion. And I think the reason for that is because Aristotle is somewhere like a foundational philosopher for what the philosophy we have today. So a lot of what he tells us is a starting point for a lot of things that are still discussed. So inevitably a discussion on Aristotle is probably going to end up on one of these really like hotly contested discussions somewhere, which we also like touched on the essentialism debate, for example.
Right, right. Anyone else? Right.
Yeah, so sure, like in whole like in the philosophy, two things intrigues me the most. The first is the Hellenistic point of view because I am kind of a pessimist, you know. So that and the another one is the direct connection of philosophy with science, like the branch of epistemology or whatever the branch that deals with the metaphysics and all. So yeah, this discussion was too good, and I didn't want it to leave and end, but I think like the ensigns are also like near, so people might have to. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
I'd say that the purpose of this discussion was to end. The final cause was that it ended.
yes.
Natai, yeah, you were saying something.
Yeah, so just an ending, like on this discussion again, it was really interesting. Why I think so is that Aristotle is so vast, right? We've not touched on so many points about him. We've not spoken about his ethics, his politics, so many parts of him that we've not touched upon, and still it was such a wholesome discussion. I think that just throws light on the vastness of the topic, and yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
I just like you name Aristotle, and it's not a definite, like definite branch that Aristotle's philosophy deals with. He just, he tried to explain each and everything, and he goes on different, like, different branches like politics, then ethics, then physics. Like whatever you name, and Aristotle tried to answer each and everything in his own way, and that was quite interesting. And I don't think like one class or two, discussion can nearly capture the essence of Aristotle. So yeah, it was too good. But it's
Yeah,
sad.
there's a thing, right? Like him
Yeah.
answering everything is because that was what philosophy was then. Like physics and all weren't defined, right? It was just part of philosophy. Aristotle was a philosopher, so he touched things.
Yeah, basically, whenever I hear the name of Aristotle, one thing comes into my mind, like his hunger for answers, basically. He was so hungry for answers, man. He tried to, answer each and everything he came across, even little things. And, big things like cosmos, and little things like how you should deal in day to day life, the ethics. So, this is what Aristotle really is. Like he tried, his hunger for answer was, you know and I guess like each and every people who are in this meeting right now, and in the philosophy club itself, like people also are, in a way, they are hungry for some kind of answers, right? So yeah, so that was
Right.
my remark. And yeah, that this is
Anyone else who would like to make concluding remarks? Jyotsna, I think you participated in discussion for the first time or like the second time?
No, I participated the previous time, but like I joined late, so I wasn't able to
Oh,
capture. But this time I was throughout the discussion, and yeah, it was very engaging.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jyotsna. Nimal, you want to say anything?
Yeah. Like I think I mean I really got like fulfilled the purpose of joining the philosophy club today because essentially we even came to the question of why do we live? Like what is the purpose of life? So
Right.
today like my whole brain is mushed right now. So I don't
but,
have any more words to
but
explain.
Vimal, we are dying to see the wave of hands that you do at the end. Just please do that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll come on.
Okay. Thank you, Nimal. Thank you, Nimal. Yeah, I mean, like, we'll discuss all this in great detail when we come to existentialism, man. One hell of an interesting topic, of course.
I really can't wait for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Some touch upon some aspects in like Hellenistic philosophy, which we're going to do next, right? We'll probably divide it into two parts, I think. Yeah. First part we'll deal with skepticism and cynicism, and second part we'll probably deal with stoicism and Epicureanism, right? So yeah, we'll touch upon these topics, and yeah, it'll be really fun as well. And stoicism is like, आजकल मतलब vogue में है बहुत ज़्यादा, ठीक है? Like every
Stoicism.
person is like, quoting Marcus Aurelius and
I
quoting
think
Seneca, trying to become cool.
even I revisited Marcus Aurelius during lockdown. जब बहुत ही sad चल रहा था ना, इसलिए भाई चलो यार कुछ तो करना है, किसी तरह तो figure out करना है क्या करना
Yeah,
है. But yeah.
they provide good tools to sort of deal with the shit that happens around you, man. Like it's a good set of tools. They are limited, but at the same time they're very useful as well. Anyone else?
Yeah, even as
Anuja,
well.
Aryan, you wanna guys say something before we close?
Aryan to can't, I think. Like Aryan to physically can't because of the recording.
Oh, achha, that's the thing. Okay. Anything else? That okay. So I think if not, then we'll close. Okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Nitya.
So like this was I think the most interactive session I attended till date, and this was really interesting. Like I had a lot of fun. Thank you
Okay.
for that.
Oh, you're most welcome. Okay, thank you. I mean, like, it is something that, it's something about discussion and, something about engaging on a certain topic that sort of, answers more question than just reading about stuff can, right? I can read about Aristotle, but the sort of clarity that, you have while discussing things, right? With how things connect with each other, how, when 9, 10, 12 people just sit and, discuss the same thing, there are many aspects of it which come up, which is, again, goes back to the reason why we established Philosophy Club, the purpose, the final cause of Philosophy Club, that there is something that I touch upon every time. And yeah, Discourse is the most superior, proved yet again. Thank you, Dipayan. I think that is like a note on which we would like to close today's discussion. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for engaging. Thank you all for discussing all these interesting topics. And we'll see you all next time on, when we discuss the next unit, which is the Hellenistic philosophy, which happened after, Aristotle and all this thing were happening. And, we'll discuss famous people like Pyrrhonius. We'll discuss Diogenes, which is, I think, a discussion that is like worth attending. And we'll discuss about all the antics that Diogenes throws and, their explanation of everything. And it will be a very fun discussion, I'm sure about it. So yeah, I mean, thank you everyone for joining, and I'll see you all next time, I guess. Bye.